Andrew Peters here with Good Baseball. If you're wondering why hitters can hit the ball so much harder than you can throw it and so much farther than you can throw it, I have 4 words for you. Front hip, internal rotation. First and foremost, it's important that we know what hip internal rotation is. Hip internal rotation is the movement of the thigh bone or the femur rotating inward with the hip socket towards the midline, or in other words, taking your knee and turning it inward and making your ankle go outwards. On the other side of the coin is hip external rotation. Hip external rotation is the movement of the thigh rotating outward from the pelvis, and in other words, taking your knee and moving it outside of your body and taking your inner ankle and moving it towards the inside of your body. Hip internal rotation and hip external rotation are inversely related. This means that when one hip internally rotates, the other hip will have trouble internally rotating as well. Or from a different perspective, when one hip internally rotates, the other one has an easier time externally rotating. Some stretches that showcase this inverse relationship include the butterfly stretch, the supine dual hip internal rotation stretch, and the seated 90-90 stretch. As you can see, it's significantly harder to get both knees on the ground when both of them are moving internally or externally simultaneously. But when one is internal and the other is external, the range of motion window increases dramatically, and you can get both knees to touch the ground. Now that we've got hip internal and external rotation cleared up, let's go ahead and talk about how it relates to hitting and pitching. I don't care what anyone says. Fundamentally speaking, hitting and pitching are the exact same movement. People will argue that they're not because in one, you're trying to throw a ball, and in the other, you're trying to swing a bat. And in the one, you're trying to throw a ball, you're trying to throw it downhill. And when you're swinging a bat, you're trying to swing it on a line or uphill. However, simply put, in order to accomplish both tasks, rotation of the midsection has to occur, period. Don't believe me? Let's go ahead and take a look. As you can see, when a pitcher is moving downhill, he has to gather and load his back hip into external rotation, whereas on the other side of the coin, the hitter also has to gather and load his back hip into external rotation, so that way they can both uncoil for maximum power. In that uncoil movement, you can see that both the pitcher and the hitter maintain elite front hip internal rotation throughout. Here's where that inverse relationship comes into play big time. When the front hip moves into external rotation right around plant point, the back hip is forced to launch itself into internal rotation. I think it's neat to know that in hitting, one cannot occur independently from the other. Interestingly enough, however, when you're pitching, there is that swinging the gate movement or sensation or opening up that hip way too early into external rotation that happens. No hitter can actively swing their front hip open and hit the ball as effectively as they would like. And as a matter of fact, there is probably not a single hitter in Major League Baseball, minor league baseball, or college baseball that actively swings the gate with their front hip while they are swinging a bat. Elite hitters simply do an exceptionally elite job of keeping that front hip closed to guide and direct power. Hitters have this concept called stretch. It's what allows for elite bat speed and elite exit velocity. Pitchers actually have this concept of stretch too, but it's known as hip to shoulder separation. I'm going to go ahead and pull a cliche out, but it's a cliche for a reason. When you go ahead and stretch a rubber band to its maximum stretch capacity and you go to snap it, it snaps harder the farther that you stretch it out. This is the concept of being able to hold front hip internal rotation and back hip external rotation as long as possible. When you hold that front hip internal rotation as long as possible, it makes it easier for that back hip to launch from external into internal rotation. The body simply doesn't want to hold those uncomfortable positions. So when it does hold these positions, it wants to get out of them as fast as possible. So when we hold those elite end ranges, it will snap as fast as possible to give us those elite power numbers and elite throwing velocities. Being able to get into these ranges of motion is not necessarily the easiest thing in the world. That's why when you see some stiffer moving hitters and pitchers who can't generally externally rotate with their back hip to create that coil effect, are able to hold front hip internal rotation exceptionally well. Prime examples would be Barry Bonds or Garrett Cole. So when in doubt, as a pitcher, hold front hip internal rotation down the mound as long as possible, and you'll probably start to see an increase in velocity.